Welcome to episode number 2 of The Learning Curve Show. I am David Alves, and I am joined by my co-host, Greg Margolin. We are senior solution architects and managing partners of Global Quality Partners. So, Greg, what are we talking about today?
Let's talk about what we call shelf-proof automation. Over the years, we've met many clients who have attempted to do automation as part of their software development lifecycle. Many tried, but few succeeded. They may get something up and running for a few months to a year, but they eventually get overwhelmed with the maintenance of their hundreds to thousands of test cases. They cannot keep up, and the automation ends up on the proverbial shelf, unused. Often teams keep running automation in an almost ritualistic manner, obtaining fairly incomprehensible results, but not daring to touch the code because the original developers are no longer with the company.
Yes, Greg, we see this time and time again. The problem is that everybody wants simplicity, right? And tool vendors often convince their customers that they can have what they want and simply record and play back their test. Well, the truth is that you need to build the right framework or what we call software architecture and way of using it. In other words, you need to build maintenance into the automation. This is something that developers have known for years, and they do so in order to maintain their applications that they put out into their organizations every day. Automation is no different. It is development. Even with scriptless tools, it still is development.
So David, how does one go about architecting automation the right way?
Before we get into that, Greg, how about a word from our sponsor? We'll be right back.
What's wrong, Andy? You seem stressed. My product is launching next week, but the performance team cannot conduct scalability testing until Q2 next year. The poor guys are completely swamped. Why not have the BAs, QA, and product managers do it for you? What the... Martin, they don't have the skill set to do that. Sure they do. We all do. Even you can help out, Andy. But how? With Pickled Test Ops services from GQP. What's that? It's a service that enables people like us to create user experience and performance tests in plain English. How do I get this service right away? Call the guys at GQP. They'll have you up and running in no time at all, and they're extremely cost-effective. What are you waiting for? Give them a call.
Go Pickle! Go Pickle!
Okay, everybody, we're back. Well, Greg, let me start by first showing you what a typical test case looks like at most organizations. But before I do that, I want to pick an application under test for an example. So let me introduce you to the Heat Clinic. As you can see, the Heat Clinic is a typical website. We use it for demo purposes at GQP. It is a site where you can buy various hot sauces as well as related merchandise. You can see up here on the upper right, there's a login link. The user would click on this link. They would then log into the app. They would then return to the home page. They would scroll down, hover over the hot sauce, for instance, in the sample test case we're going to show, and they would be able to add it to the cart. From there, they'd be able to view the cart, and go to checkout and enter in any of their shipping information, etc. You get the picture. Okay, so now let's look at your typical test case. Usually there's a test case named that describes what it does. You then have a series of steps, as in here we have navigate to the Heat Clinic website at this particular URL. Then step number 2 is click the login link in the upper left hand of the home page. Step number 3, enter the email of a previously registered standard consumer user in the email field on the left side, a login section of the screen. Number 4, click the login button. Number 5, click on you get the picture, on and on and on. Pick the hot sauce as you saw me do, add it to the cart, etc., etc. The problem with this approach is that there are actually 3 logical layers here, all combined into one. The first logical layer is what we call the workflow or transaction layer. It tells you what to do. In other words, what you're going to do is step 1, then step 2, step 3. It is a series of steps that must be followed in a particular workflow order. The second unspoken layer here is the GUI manipulation or steps layer. We have, in this case, 8 known identifiable individual steps, all of which manipulate the GUI. We're clicking the login link. We're entering in something into the email field. We're clicking the login button. And lastly, we have the assumption built in here that there is a GUI object model throughout the entire thing, so that there's a way to recognize the objects on the screen. You know, how do you identify the login button? That's all built in here. It's an assumption, and it's built into usually in a repository in most tools with special characteristics, depending on whether it's a web client or thick client, as to how to recognize the objects on the screen. So in essence, what we have are 3 convoluted logical layers: a workflow or transaction layer that tells us what to do, a GUI manipulation or steps layer that tells us how to do it, and a GUI object model. So if there is the introduction of a change in any way, this model breaks very easily. So let's assume we have hundreds of thousands of use cases that we've built in this traditional model. Okay, and let's say the steps change. You got to do one step before you do the other, or they add an additional step. Well, that means all hundreds of thousands of test cases have to be changed. Or let's say how you do a specific step. You know, there are new steps or sub-steps within a step, or different order to those steps that need to be done. If you have to change that and how you interact with the GUI object or through the GUI object model, your tests become brittle, and if you have hundreds of thousands, you might need to change that. Or if the development team changes the underlying identifiers that you use to recognize the GUI objects on the screen, that could break hundreds of thousands of tests. And this is where you end up with the maintenance nightmare. The more tests you have, the harder it is to maintain and keep up, and eventually you end up with shelfware automation. All right. So rather than put all 3 of these layers together, the proper way to do this is to separate the layers, right? You modularize them. All right, that's what developers do. You put all the workflow or transitional what to do operations in one layer or set of code or library, so to speak, modular piece of code, and it calls a series of steps in another module, the steps module or GUI manipulation module, which tells how we're going to carry out each of those steps, which in turn interacts with a GUI object model, again, typically represented as a automation repository in some of the older tools. In Selenium, it's referred to as the page object model, but every page has methods and objects on it that allow you to interact with it, and the steps layer calls into that module or libraries to make changes. In this way, we isolate any changes to specific layers. So should there be a need for change, we don't have to change 100 or thousands of test cases. We can make a change at the appropriate layer or module. All right. And we can refine this even further. What we can do is introduce a new layer called the business logic layer, or the business domain language, right? Where what we want is a veneer on the front that very seldomly changes. So if we have hundreds of thousands of test cases, once they are written, they almost never change. And if you think about any industry or business domain, let's say insurance, You've got claims, you've got adjudications, you got premiums. This business has existed in this manner for hundreds of years, and nothing ever really changes. So if you could write your test cases in plain old English in the language of the business domain, adjudicating a claim will almost never change. So their test case almost never has to change. Even if you have hundreds of thousands of them, it is very seldom that the business itself and the fundamental concepts of that business domain actually really change. Now, there are a couple ways to do that. One is to use behavior-driven development, or BDD. All right, BDD lets you to say, given some precondition, when some action happens, then some outcome happens. And you can define that in plain old English so that everybody can understand. Right, with the old typical test case model, you got to know the application to follow the workflow and understand what buttons are being clicked and what's happening. You just have to trust Mr. QA or Mr. Performance guy to tell you that it was done right and that he did all the right tests. Right? But we can all collaborate using English and a BDD format. Let's take a look at what something like that looks like. So here is a typical BDD scenario outline, right? You still got the test case name at the top, but now we've got given the user navigates to the Heat Clinic website, and these items you see in these less than greater than brackets are actually data. And many of you have probably heard about data-driven automated tests where you can change the nature of the test by substituting pieces of data. So you're not always using the same username or password. This isn't a fully syntactically correct rendition of a BDD test case, but it's here to show you the basics. So when the logger logs in with a username and the user adds hop and hot sauce, then he can open his shopping cart and initiate checkout, and he can enter his billing and shipping information, and he selects his fulfillment and shipping options. Then he completes the checkout process. Then the user should receive a message indicating that the order status is successful or failure, right? This business domain e-commerce language of selecting an item, adding it to a shopping cart, checking out, billing information, fulfillment and shipping options, that almost never changes. So this makes your test much more impervious to change, and there's an additional layer that we can add on the front of this. Now, a lot of tools support BDD. Even some of the scriptless tools, Tosca supports BDD. SmartBear Test Complete supports BDD. And of course, if you're using Selenium, you can do whatever you want because it's a coding language. Whether you're using Java, Python, JavaScript, whatever, for Selenium, you can do this or follow this exact same model. Now, another approach, if you have a tool that actually requires coding itself, you can do more or less the same thing as BDD by using expressive function names or procedure names, given some precondition when some action is taken, then some outcome is expected, as you see here in the note on the left. This is what that might look like in practice. Very close to BDD, though I started everything with a when and got rid of the and, so we know that they're all when statements or actions in the middle between a precondition and an expected outcome. You'll also notice the data isn't embedded in the sentences. It's actually passed as parameters, so it doesn't read as well or easy. But it's another way, if you have a tool that doesn't do BDD, but allows some form of coding or logic, you can kind of accomplish the same thing in this manner. So this is what you want as a whole, right? The multi-level logic layer model and what it looks like. You've got format 1, format 2. You've got the business domain logic layer, which seldom ever changes, and you've got your hundreds or thousands of test cases written to this level. You've got your workflow or transaction layer, which then calls your GUI manipulation or steps layer, and then your GUI object model and how you're interacting with the actual GUI. And this allows you to isolate changes in an appropriate place when needed and to keep your automation off the shelf. So let's go over the benefits of shelfware proof automation, of the shelfware proof automation model, that is. Number one, there's no need to change hundreds of thousands of test cases, hardly ever. Anyone who knows the business domain knows exactly what each test case does and accomplishes. In this way, this approach fosters collaboration across disciplines and democratizes the testing process. Great for agile or sprint type scrum situations where you got people from multiple disciplines all trying to figure out the definition of done, and they can all understand what the tests are and what they do and what the definition of done actually is. You also have this business domain logic layer, again, that is very likely to ever change. If there's a workflow change in the test cases or in the what to do, you simply make it in the workload or transaction layer, as previously said. If the steps of a workflow need to change, you can change it in the steps layer. And if how you identify the GUI objects needs to change, you change it in that layer without impacting the other layers, and you're able to maintain it quickly and easily without having to refactor hundreds or thousands of test cases. And lastly, the same approach can be used for both API and performance or user experience testing. All right, so stay tuned for a future episode because we will cover that, right? You don't have to have a GUI object model. You can actually work with APIs at the bottom layer, and/or you can create tests that do end-to-end user experience and measurement in plain English for your performance test. That's about it, Greg. Anything you'd like to add for our listeners?
I think this is a great and useful list. I would like to add just a few more things. Remember, not everything can be automated, nor should it be. Automation lends itself well to well-defined, routine, repetitive tasks. But when uncertainty is involved, humans are so much better. Don't rush in. Take the time to build it right up front and invest in your ability to maintain your automation test suites. Such an investment would pay off handsomely by significantly extending the life and utility of your automation test suites.
How about one last word from our sponsor, Greg, before we wrap things up?
What is this? It's a gift to you for recommending Pickle Test Ops services from GQP. We brought in GQP just like you said, and in a very short time. Me, Jamie from QA, Bob, our project manager, and Mary Jane, the product manager, created and ran the performance test we needed, and the boss was very happy and shipped our product. Look at these beautiful end-to-end user experience test results we received with Pickle Test Ops services. And we wrote our scripts in plain English. What are you waiting for? Give them a call.
Go Pickle! Go Pickle!
That's it, folks. If you have any questions about what you heard here today or would like to discuss anything else, please send them to the email addresses you see on the screen, and we will try to cover them in the upcoming weeks. Remember, it is your questions that drive this show. Thanks and goodbye. We would be delighted to see you again next week.
All right, folks, thanks for your time and goodbye.